So thanks for tuning into this conversation, which marks the end of the 16 days of activism to end violence against women and girls, a global campaign which the Chartered Institute of Housing supports each year. It provides an opportunity to raise awareness, champion advocacy, and share knowledge and good practice of the role we can all play. The campaign is particularly important to CIH because of the interlinked role of housing and domestic abuse, and the important role that housing professionals can play in tackling what is often a very hidden crime. Statistics from the charity Refuge tell us that domestic abuse will affect on average 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men in their lifetime. 1 in 5 children are living in homes affected, and since the introduction of the Domestic Abuse Act in 2021, these are now recognised as victims of domestic abuse in their own right. We know survivors, often with children, who are forced to leave their homes because of domestic abuse can face substantial barriers accessing safety, with the chronic undersupply of social homes playing a key part in this. In 2022, over 10,000 people fleeing abuse were unable to access safe housing because of a lack of appropriate support. So it's not surprising that domestic abuse is consistently one of the leading causes of homelessness amongst women. To help us reflect on the role that housing professionals can play in helping with this, I'm really pleased to be joined by a fantastic panel. We've got 2 former CIH presidents, Alison Inman and Jim Strang, who use their presidential campaigns to raise awareness of how the housing sector can support through the Make a Stand pledge. We also have Judith Vickress, Senior Housing Manager for Standing Together Against Domestic Abuse and the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, which CIH is part of. And last but not least, Callum Chomczuk, National Director of CIH Scotland. Thank you all for giving us your time. Before we start, I wonder if I can ask each of you just to say a bit about your interest in this area and why you think the 16 Days campaign is important. Alison, can I come to you first?
Okay, we have, so your first, why is it important to housing and to me? We've not shifted the dial on domestic abuse in any kind of substantial way for decades. If we look at the very, very sharp end of domestic abuse, we're talking about deaths, the number of women and increasingly children who die as a result of domestic abuse isn't reducing. So despite the amount of publicity, information, we've brought the issue out over decades out into the open, but fundamentally this is not an issue that is getting better. For me at heart, it's also a housing issue. At its most obvious, domestic abuse often, not entirely, but often takes place within the home. And to me, homes where we're meant to feel the safest, and for too many people, and in the context of the 16 Days campaign, for too many women and children, home is the least safe place. And as a professional body for housing, I think that makes it our business.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know in the pledge that you obviously played a key part in, I was just looking back at the cover of that this morning where it says, in your words, these are our homes, our people, this is our problem. I think that's a really powerful starting point. Jim, how about you? Obviously you picked up as president, this is your campaign too. So what does this mean to you? Why is the campaign important?
As Alison says, we haven't shifted the dial very much over the last 50 years or so. And from my perspective, and probably later on I'll be able to describe why I decided to continue with Alison's campaign, but it was basically because Alison speaks with passion and commitment about the issue. And folk like me, I'm 67 now, but for 50 odd years ago, I buried the impact of being in a domestic abuse situation with a very aggressive father. I buried it, hid it, managed to get on my life without it impacting me. I thought, but it did. And when I heard Alison talk about the Make a Stand campaign, and when I heard Alison talk with passion and commitment about why she wanted and we needed to support Women's Aid and how it is an issue within our houses. These are our people, these are our homes, it is our problem. And men in particular are part of the problem, the biggest part of the problem. We are the ones that perpetrate the vast majority of this, as my father did. And I remember, Alison, I don't know if you remember this, sitting in Edinburgh, you're giving a presidential address, and it was surreal for me, because every single noise in the room, and these big banquets are busy, just disappeared, and I could hear Alison's voice. And I was sitting next to the Scottish Chief Executive of Scottish Women's Aid, and Terry Arafat, who was the Chief Executive of CIH, and all the memories came flooding back. And I said to myself, well, Alison started this. I just took on from Alison's lead.
Thanks, Jim. That's so powerful, and thank you for sharing a bit of your story. It came through really clearly, and just a reminder, as you say, of how of the absolutely devastating impact of any form of abuse, and how important it is to speak up, and how important it is to have both men and women advocating for it. So thank you. Judith, how about you? What brought you to this?
Well, oh gosh, I've been working in the domestic abuse sector for well over 20 years. And I guess the reason I came into it, because I was doing something completely different. I was a family lawyer previously, but I was really wanting to understand why so many of the women that were coming to see me in a very small market town, so I was the only female lawyer there, so they seemed to all come to me to get injunctions, as it was then, why they would come back time and time again, and why they were kind of going back to these perpetrators as I kind of thought and understood it at the time. So I went to do some voluntary work with Women's Aid locally, and never looked back, if I'm honest, because it's just I always say to my children, I found out what I wanted to do when I grew up when I was 30, because it just absolutely drew me in, and it's my absolute passion to change the way that we view domestic abuse, and we need to talk about it. So I mean, I worked for many years with survivors of domestic abuse, but have also worked for kind of half my sort of career with national systems change projects and organisations. I just feel, I've said this before, but I never felt so passionately about the fact that we can really achieve something with housing. I feel so passionately that the housing sector can make one of the biggest differences. And as Alison's talked about, I guess the stark figures are 2 to 3 women every single week are murdered as a result of domestic abuse in this country, and many more are dying by suicide as a way out, and we're understanding more and more what that picture looks like at the moment. And I think, as again what Alison said about most of this happening in the home, the home's not the safest place to be for women experiencing domestic abuse, and well over 70% of those women who have died have been murdered in or just outside their own homes. So housing has such a vital role to play in that early identification, a good response, and making sure that the home is a safe place for women and children to be. And I think one thing, again, I always say is, imagine if those 2 to 3 deaths and all of those suicides every single week were deaths as a result of terrorism. The media storm and the government interest would be absolutely enormous, and you can absolutely guarantee that we'd be doing more nationally to make this different. And in America, where the figures are even worse, they do call domestic abuse intimate terrorism, and I think that's not a sort of bad way of looking at it if it makes people sit up and listen. And whilst we with 16 days of activism and 16 days of action, which is the white ribbon side of thing, and I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Jim said and thank Jim for telling his story as well. It's so important that men speak out against male violence against women and girls, because men are the problem, and I know that we'll hear not all men, absolutely not all men, but all men have the ability to stop this and to stand up and call it out and make sure that it stops. So I think the 16 days, so domestic abuse is happening 365 days a year, but the 16 days gives us that high profile window to shout even louder, and for some of us it has to be quite loud, to get this message out. So, you know, thank you to CIH for really kind of using the opportunity to allow us that window, I guess, as well.
Yeah, thank you, Judith. And it's always so interesting to hear what's brought people into this. Obviously, this is your everyday. And as we were saying just before we started the call, this is way more than a job for you, isn't it? I know this is a real genuine passion. And that's, yeah. I mean, a lot of people that, you know, don't know what they want to do even age 50. So I think 30 was pretty good going. But yeah, to have a real sort of sense of vocation and to really be able to put your kind of education and your skills into practice, campaigning to make things better is brilliant, and is obviously something that CIH want to be really supporting as we think about what that means for professionalism. So Callum, can I come to you and just hear a bit about, I know we're going to come on to what you've been doing in CIH Scotland, but what's your kind of background in this area?
So I think, you know, why does the 16 days matter? I think, you know, I think as Judith was saying there, I think it's a really good opportunity for us. It's still a difficult opportunity, but to try and drive some systemic change, because the approach to the housing sector, every sector, when we try to change organisation at a time or kind of household at a time, it doesn't work. Like we get good practice and we see great practice across the UK, but do you know what? It's not systemic. It doesn't change cultures. It doesn't change attitudes from generation to generation. And what 16 days is, it gives us a platform, justified, but gives a platform and allows us to put pressure on decision makers, and it makes them feel the need to respond, and they don't respond at the scale and they don't respond at the pace, and we often get crumbs, if anything, from year to year. But it does create that platform. And I'm newer to this than to the other three speakers, so I can't speak around kind of the slow pace of change with any real confidence. I would say in Scotland we have saw more engagement, whether that's leading to genuine change in practice and outcomes for victims experiencing domestic abuse. I think there's a debate around that. We're definitely seeing more engagement around domestic abuse and the responsibility of government, society and social housing providers. So I think it does, and it has proven to be a really important platform. And I think it's for us to continue to organise, continue to mobilise, continue to be clear about what we want the changes to be and how they can actually improve outcomes for victims, because that's it, Rachel. I think in each of the nations we'll take it at a different pace. We'll be focused on different things. I think that's really important. We're working in different legal, political contexts, but it gives us a platform to push for systemic change, and that's ultimately the only thing that's going to make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely. That's got a thumbs up from Alison.
Yeah, I agree with Callum. I wasn't meaning to do a thumbs up. I was trying to raise my hand, but very focal. Didn't work. So I was just thinking when Callum was saying that, and I was sort of, you know, thinking back about, well, why did I choose sort of domestic abuse? And I think sometimes the stars align almost. And I think three things happened around the same time. One was I've been involved in the sort of governance of two different women's refuges, many, you know, a long time ago, and I was interviewed as part of an oral history project. When you're old enough to be interviewed as part of an oral history project, it's quite salutary. But we're looking at the history and development of women's refuges within the east of England. And I first was involved in sort of 1986, I think, which is a pretty long time ago. And I was interviewed by this researcher, and you don't often get the chance to sit down and really reflect. She was really good at asking questions. So thinking about where we were there and where, you know, then and where we are now. And that made me begin to realise, as someone who'd moved outside of that space, how little had changed over the years. And that was, you know, really gave me sort of food for thought. The next thing that happened around that time was actually seeing the dial begin to shift in Wales. You know, the late Carl Sargent, who'd been the housing minister in Wales and did a phenomenal amount as a man to put domestic abuse on a whole host of different national policy agendas. and he began to tie funding for housing to providers having some kind of having a decent policy around domestic abuse, and that was the first time I'd seen that, and I don't think that was great. But then also, and you can't underestimate the impact, 3 women in a laundry room, but the beginnings of DAHA, and I was privileged to meet Kelly and Goody and Megan, who'd set up the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance, and they were got organisational buy-in, but we're doing some absolutely phenomenal work, but joining the dots of different players in different policy and practice areas. And at first, I'll be absolutely honest, I thought I'd love to do something about domestic abuse during my presidential year. I'm not sure if CIH would like that. I'm not sure if the organisation would be up for it, because it didn't feel as if domestic abuse was really intertwined within the housing policy landscape, and I underestimated CIH then. And I, and Terry was absolutely, sort of go for it. But I think sometimes it's just about the right, the right people in the right place at the right time, and that responsibility when you do get the opportunity to have some kind of a platform, then it's incumbent upon you to try and bring people together to do as much as you can.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone that knows you, Alison, knows you're very good about bringing people together. And we'll come on. Perhaps that's a kind of neat segue into so what did you do then in your presidential role with Make a Stand? Lots of people, I'm sure, will be reasonably familiar and will have heard of it, but it would be great if you could just share a bit around, perhaps elaborate on how it came about and what it was designed to do.
So I think the other thing that happened at the same time was that Polly Neat, who had been chief exec of Women's Aid, moved to Shelter to become chief executive of Shelter, and again that felt like, oh, we've got somebody bringing that domestic abuse expertise into the broader housing sector, and you had people like Nicola Sharp-Jeffs, who around that time established Surviving Economic Abuse, so a charity looking at economic and financial abuse and sort of widening it. And I think we were beginning to look down a much broader lens about where housing, domestic abuse, did intersect in a way that's much broader than what's the homelessness responsibility for a local authority. It's much, or what's the basic landlord responsibility. It's much sort of broader than that. So it was just, I remember just getting a group of people together at CIH in London, and you always pick the most enthusiastic people, pick the people with energy, pick the people who want to change the world. And actually you don't have to, it wasn't about getting a load of chief execs to buy in. That's not how, yes, that's important. Don't want to disrespect all CIH's chief executive members, obviously, but you go for the, people with passion and the people with expertise. It was really important to bring in people from across the devolved nations where practice is different. That was incredibly useful. The thing I did that I'm almost most proud of, was my husband is a criminologist, and together we put on a conference that was held at Savills. The other thing I learned is how you can get people to do things for free just by asking. So a big shout out to Robert Grundy at Savills for enabling that to go ahead. But that was bringing together academia. So there's so much research in universities going on around domestic abuse in lots and lots of different contexts. The housing sector, and that was from associations, local authorities, strategic housing functions, but also the women's sector. And that was a really, really important part of it. The women's sector is complex, and I think it's really hard to navigate for people from outside. So, 30 years ago, you just had women's refugees and you had women's aid. And that was, and now we've got many more organisations working in specialised spaces, incredible charities working with, ethnic minority women and, marginalised women and migrant women. You've got, people working with perpetrators. You've got different tiers of organisations. Commissioning's got really complicated, and that's why part of the pledge was about making information available to people who need it in a format that they need it, because it's a really hard space to sort of navigate. And then it sort of, took over. I got great support from my colleagues at CIH. I want to do a big shout out to Steve Hayes, who, really helped us with the comms, stuff around the pledge. And I will always remember somebody sending me a photograph of a trades van from Suffolk Housing, as it was then, with the Make a Stand pledge on the livery. And I just remember thinking, gosh, people are,
It's when it's cutting through.
Yeah. So, and then Jim came along and with a completely different focus, and it was just fantastic to have. I'm just so I am proud of Jim.
Yeah.
That to actually tell his story in the way that he did, and to go through the emotional labour around that, and to do that emotional work in public. It's just absolutely phenomenal, and we owe him a great deal.
Yeah. Speaking of Jim, we've sadly just lost him off the recording, so I'm hoping he's going to appear back on, but he's the joys of joining, I think, from where he is in Scotland means the bandwidth perhaps isn't as strong as it needs to be, so we're hoping he'll reappear. But if nothing else, it was brilliant to have him share some of his story, as you say, and it is so brave to make yourself vulnerable like that, isn't it? And so powerful, because of course that's exactly what this is all about. It's vulnerability, and how important it is that we're there to support people in clearly some of the most awful circumstances.
And to sort of pick up a little bit as Jim dropped out on what he was able to do, was to actually start doing some work around contractors. And that was, and there were two, Jane Nelson, who is a wonderful, wonderful woman, put on an event in Bristol with a whole group of trade staff, and Jim's now reappeared. Do you remember that day in Bristol? That was phenomenal, wasn't it? Yeah. And it was a room full of trade staff. And Jim spoke first, and then we had, it shows the importance of the lived experience and giving voice to people. So we had an incredible young man who talked about growing up, with an abusive father, and that was incredibly difficult to hear. And then we heard from Nikki Spear, who I think now works for DAHA, is that right?
She is. She's with us. She's our whole housing programme manager. Yeah, so proud to have her with us.
And another woman, Ali Pierce from Sovereign. And you could literally have heard a pin drop.
Yeah.
It was just great. And actually, that thing about saying these are the staff that are going into people's homes day in, day out, they really are the ones who can make a difference.
Yeah. And it's that reminder, isn't it? So that sometimes there's a real danger of othering, but of course domestic abuse can happen to anyone at any time, and there'll be an awful lot of housing professionals who have their own experience in the past or currently that are dealing with it. So we're talking about how we support people in our own teams and organisations, as well as the people who we might be providing homes for. But Jim, over to you. I think you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I was just harping back to that day, Alison. You're absolutely spot on. The room was just full of hard-nosed tradesmen, and you could hear a pin drop, and the number of men that came up to me after that session to tell me their story, what they had suffered, and what they had experienced whilst being on the tools, getting into people's houses. It just brought it home just how important that everyone in the housing sector, be it a housing officer, be it a housing manager, be it the person dealing with rent arrears, right the way through to the guy in fitting the tap and servicing the gas system. We all have a role to play, and we should never ever diminish that. And that's why I just harken back to the need for 16 days of action. We constantly have to remember. We can look back and we say we've got 2 really first-class bits of legislation on the statute book, but legislation is one thing. It's the doing is the important thing. And that day was just sublime for me because it really, really brought it home. And it was one of the finest sessions I've attended as president during my time for that reason.
That's brilliant. That sounds so powerful. And perhaps if I can, we can perhaps just come on then to think about what difference you think Make a Stand has made. So for anyone who's not aware, that was a pledge landlords could sign up to, where they would commit to making sure they've got a policy in place to support residents affected by domestic abuse, to make sure information's available, to have their own internal HR policy, to be supporting staff, to be championing it, and of course where you're delivering service through others, so contractors and so on, you're making sure everyone is equipped to know, as you said, Jim, the signs to be looking out for, and then the appropriate support and safeguarding response. We've got, I think at the last count, over 400 organisations who've signed up to that now, and there's also a supporters pledge if you're an organisation that wants to demonstrate support and a sort of alliance, but you're not maybe a landlord. What difference do you think that's making, and what more would you like to see going forward?
Could I throw in here? I was a wee bit disappointed when we did a wee audit on it, that organisations may have signed up, but they really weren't always walking the talk, and that disappointed me greatly. The organisation I'm in at the moment, when I walked in the front door, they've got the pledge up on the wall in the notice board coming in. So it's going to be really interesting the next couple of days when I go to see are we really walking the talk here or not. But it did disappoint me that the numbers in Scotland, I think Callum could probably confirm this, did disappoint me greatly that we weren't walking the talk. And it even underlines even more, we cannot let this go. We must keep on at this. And if it takes another 4 decades of my lifetime to get the message across, then so be it. There's so much at stake here. There's far too many people suffering, far too many kids having their childhood blighted, far too many women suffering, far too many victims. We can't sit back and let it continue. So my plea for everybody out there listening to this, if your organisation signed the pledge, in the name of God, make sure you're implementing it. Please don't let it slip. Otherwise, Alison Inman will pay a visit.
You've been warned. So, Callum, I know, Callum, you've worked with Women's Aid to do the audit that Jim mentioned. So perhaps you can tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So, there has been a huge amount of good that's come to Make a Stand. So actually, I agree with you. We should never be satisfied with where things are because it's not good enough. But actually, we also should recognise the success that we've had. So in Scotland, obviously the jurisdiction, the legal framework's different in England, so we didn't work with DAHA. But ourselves and Scottish Women's Aid realised if we want landlords to sign up to Make a Stand and make it meaningful, we need to help them, because actually everybody needs help. There's a lot of embarrassment about domestic abuse. There's a lot of shame that people don't understand it, and because they don't understand it, they avoid it and they pretend it doesn't happen. And what we need to do is not pretend that isn't the reality, because that is the reality. So we recognise we need to support people. So we work with Scottish Women's Aid to develop good practice guidance on domestic abuse, and that was published. But it started in Jim's presidential terms just at the end of Alison, so the summer of 2019, before COVID, a million years ago. And we had a great response in Scotland. That was great. People signed up to it, said they commit to it. But like any policy, it's so easy to sign up to it. So ourselves and Scottish Women's Aid this year decided to see what happened. And we done a paper-based audit. We didn't interview people and we didn't look at the outcomes. But what we did have a look was we looked at all the policies. So there was 173 social landlords in Scotland. 73 had signed up to the policy. Of that, we received copies of 41 policies, only 41 out of 73, and of that, only 9 met the standard that we think was good practice. And I can't say that is delivering good outcomes, but that on paper, that's good practice. So you can see that cascading effect, like the energy from signing up doesn't always fall through in delivery. And that's back to your original question, Rachel, about kind of 16 days of activism. That's why this is so important. This is our opportunity to remind people, because actually, you know, between ourselves, the kind of institute, between what Judith's doing, between what every organisation's doing, actually there's a huge amount of support, resources and training. There's a huge amount we can offer the sector to help them better, but we also need the help of government. And actually the bit that I think we all need to say, government, we are doing what we can. We are trying to enact culture change on a pretty localised level day after day, but it's not enough. We need the leadership from you. You know, in Scotland, we've had policy changes. We had legislation a couple of years ago passed on the back of our work. And actually, I would say that I'd give credit to the Scottish Government for recognising importance. Now, it hasn't been enacted, but legislation was passed that allows social landlords to evict perpetrators and keep tenants in their own home, which is one, if they want, and this is the thing you need to get across, if they want, you still need to ask them if that's what they want. So we're waiting for that to come into effect. They've also agreed in the next housing bill, which should be out next year, there'll be a requirement for all social landlords to have a domestic abuse policy, and that will be a kind of assessed high standard. So again, really, really great. But that's getting some of the legal framework right. What we need now is the policy and practice and capacity of the sector to meet that. No point. We all know that there's thousands of policies that are in place. If legislating made the world a better place, everything would be perfect. We still need the commitment and the kind of enthusiasm of the sector. So I think Make a Stand has set the tone and framework in Scotland, I think, for a huge impact. My worry is that we wait for legislation to affect it, and then we're only maybe seeing the benefits in 10 years. Landlords don't need to wait. You can get ahead of it and start acting now.
Yeah,
and that's what makes the role of DAHA so important, and why, you know, we wanted them as a partner. And I always say to people who, you know, brilliant that you've signed up for the pledge. That means it's on the agenda. And there's some really basic stuff you can do here to show buy-in. But if you want to be expert at this, then you really need to talk to DAHA about they can help you do that.
Yeah, brilliant. So let's bring you in now, Judith, to tell us a bit more about DAHA and how it can support and move this on from being a policy to a sort of, you know, what practical support, training, accreditation that you guys can offer.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just thank you. The passion in this room, the virtual room, is just so inspiring, and it echo absolutely everything that you said. And Alison's talked a little bit about the beginnings of DAHA, which was a partnership with Standing Together, the organisation I work for, Gen2 and Peabody, with effectively, you know, 4 women in a room coming together. Goody, Kelly, Megan and Nicole Jacobs, who's now our DA Commissioner, which is absolutely fantastic here. What it does is it really looks at holding organisations to account for what they say that they're going to do. So we are asking organisations to build a foundation of good practice built on a culture that encapsulates our principles and values. And, you know, I think what's really important, because Make a Stand absolutely did make an impact, still makes an impact. People are very proud to have signed that pledge. But exactly what Jim has said, you know, we've got over, well, I think nearly 500 organisations in CIH signed up to make a pledge, but many of those haven't actually kind of followed through and implemented their policies and have procedures in place. And I think we're currently working with just over 160 housing providers and local authorities as well, with housing functions who've committed to adopt and embed standards of good practice in response to domestic abuse. And I think what we're doing with an accreditation framework that was originally sort of put together by those amazing women that we've talked about, we've kind of evolved over the last 9 years, nearly 10 years of DAHA, to make sure that it's reflective of the current legislation, of the environment. You know, post-COVID, things changed quite a lot through COVID, and actually it's COVID that has enabled so many more providers to work with us. It kind of raised the status of domestic abuse, I guess in the worst possible way, because we saw so many homicides in the first kind of 16, 17 days of the first lockdown. And we saw the government acting, and a lot of publicity around domestic abuse. And I think that, combined with already making a stand, and some of the work that we were doing, because we mobilised very quickly and went online to make sure we could reach everybody, it really kind of brought domestic abuse home to the housing sector. And I think many more organisations started to come to us to find out what they could do and what they could do better and what they could do more of. And, you know, we're also seeing, sadly, we're still seeing domestic homicide reviews telling us that housing were perhaps one of the organisations that were had a touch point with a family, and maybe didn't recognise domestic abuse through antisocial behaviour, or whatever it may be, that they could have done more in terms of that recognition. So what we have, like I say, is an accreditation framework, and we have a team of regional leads. You know, in the last sort of 3 years, we've moved to a membership model. So we've kind of put the responsibility on the housing sector to say, you know, this is going to benefit you, but most importantly, this is going to benefit the tenants, your tenants, and the people that you serve. So, you know, you need to sort of invest in this project. You need to invest in improving your response to domestic abuse, and that membership model has really enabled us. Well, we've become completely self-funded, but it's enabled us to grow from a team of 3, relying on very small charitable donations and funds, to a team of 13 and growing. And what organisations get for their membership is a team of expert regional leads who are absolutely fantastic, and they're working very closely with those providers to help them get started and guide them through our accreditation process to achieve success in terms of I guess shifting the culture within an organisation to, like I say, reflect the values and principles we have, which you know, include integrity, collaboration, empathy, empowerment, respect, accountability. And I think we're just seeing, I think, kind of thinking about what Make a Stand did and how this is a little bit, well, quite a bit different, is because this is an accreditation process. We are doing a very thorough assessment of the work that organisations are doing, and we get very close to the organisations and our members that we work with, and we are holding organisations to account for signing up, for effectively for saying that they're going to do what they're going to do. And everything has to be embedded. So the standards of good practice must be embedded within the organisation. So if you've got a policy, which is a piece of paper effectively, what are you doing with that policy? And, you know, we talk to frontline members of staff, we talk to contractors. Where is your policy? What do you know about your domestic abuse policy? How are you implementing that policy? What are the procedures? Do you follow those procedures? And we are really kind of holding those organisations to account for doing what they say that they're going to do. And I think that's where we're seeing the most incredible difference. And the evaluations tell us that, the organisations themselves tell us what a difference it makes to have embedded this culture and the standards of good practice.
Rachel, there's something to say about how incredible our members are in and amongst all this.
Yes.
And Judith was kind enough to invite me to a visit. She did to Eastlight, which is an organisation I used to be on the board of, and I sort of observed a conversation.
Amazing.
With the team that had led on, DAHA accreditation, and oh my goodness, it exemplified what is fabulous about, housing professionals who are being, these are not very, very senior people within organisations, but they've been genuinely empowered by the leadership of the organisation to crack on and do it. And they were creative, they were resolute, but it's that thing about the art and the science of housing, which is the charter of the CIH, and I go back to that a lot, because to me the sciencey bit, that's your knowledge, that's your technical expertise, and then the art is the how and the empathy and the values and all the rest. And you absolutely need both, and I think they exemplified. It was a joy to see, wasn't it, Judy?
It was a joy. I came back. It was a very long journey, but I came back absolutely buzzing and inspired. And it's just to actually see the work in practice. And I'd also visited South Essex Homes that day as well. We had a visitor over from Australia who was looking at implementing DAHA style model over in South Australia. So honestly, the work that everybody and the passion for the work blew me away in both of the organisations, and we're seeing that across the whole of the country, and it made me just so proud, and I fed that back to co-founders as well. It's just what a difference it's making. Just the simple thing of being able to have a longer conversation with somebody for whom clearly there was things going on, and then somebody saying, I've got some time, let's chat it through, and then disclosure of domestic abuse happens, and then everything, the interventions, everything happened from there. But just to be able to be kind, give somebody time, enable a disclosure, and then know what to do with it, that changes, that saves lives. And I'm not being dramatic in any shape or form. It absolutely changes and saves lives if we just open that door for somebody who keeps hearing that domestic abuse is hidden behind closed doors. There was a report out yesterday, the Domestic Abuse Commissioner's Office, on their DHR, Domestic Homicide Review Oversight mechanism, that told us that most of the large majority of those who had died, been murdered as a result of domestic abuse, were known to agencies. And it's unforgivable. Domestic homicides are predictable and preventable, and we all have. So everything we do, and the DAHA model is rooted in the coordinated community response. We are not asking housing to be experts in domestic abuse. We're not asking them to resolve the domestic abuse or save somebody from domestic abuse. We are asking them to know what domestic abuse is, highlight it, talk about it, raise awareness, identify it early, and then know how to respond. So we want them to have those policies, but we want them to give their staff the skills, the knowledge, the tools to have confidence to identify and know what to do with domestic abuse, and then engage and work in partnership with those other organisations that are the experts. So those specialist domestic abuse services, smaller buy and for services for those from different cultures, different ethnic backgrounds. Really vital that they work in partnership. And for too long, one of our kind of missions is to raise the status of housing within the coordinated community response, which is a little bit of a change of narrative from the early days of DAHA, where we talked about improving the housing response to domestic abuse. Absolutely, we're doing that. But I think what I've come to realise in my tenure in DAHA is that other organisations were not recognising the value of housing. They weren't inviting housing to the table. They weren't sharing information with housing because they didn't think housing were important or could do anything. Talking about statutory agencies mainly. So it's really important for us, because we have this platform, to raise the status of housing and tell those other organisations and agencies, come on, you need to involve housing. Again, time and time again, domestic homicide reviews are telling us that information is not being shared, and classically information is not being shared with housing, who have good engagement with people that others may call hard to reach, which I hate that term, and they know all about that family. They know the children in that family where other organisations may not. That it's just so important that housing are at that table, and that we recognise how important they are within that coordinated community response, and housing don't kind of start to think that they can be the specialists who take on the domestic abuse. You know, that's always a risk that we are seeing across the sector. And one of the, I guess, the rubs with the women's sector is the concern that housing providers perhaps are tendering and getting contracts for domestic abuse services, and that's something that we feel very passionately is not what DAHA is all about, and it's not what we need to see, because we know it's not good practice, and it's really important that partnership is happening, and to achieve accreditation in DAHA, we do talk to partners as part of the assessment, and if they are not working with or not engaging and working well in partnership with their specialist domestic abuse services, we cannot give them that accreditation status. So, but I also think it's kind of put some housing organisations off. It's like, oh no, we can't take on domestic abuse as well. We can't, solve the problem. That's the women's sector. That's somebody else's problem. We're not asking you to do that. We're just asking you to work with all of the other organisations who are set up to meet the needs of individuals and families, and work with them so that they can together, as all of the agencies, in that coordinated community response, that we together can work with the family and change the trajectory for a family, if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Jim?
Judith, absolutely spot on. But the issue for me is more, and I don't wish to sound political, it's not like me, as you know, but when you see the demise of local government, not only in England but in Scotland as well, with the pressures on budgets, a lot of these statutory agencies are hunkering down to do the absolute bare minimum. Housing associations and social landlords are struggling to backfill a lot of services, and that is my big worry at the moment. We're in a country where public services have been ransacked over the last 13 years, and we're going to have to bear that in mind. So the role of the housing sector is even going to be more crucial going forward. Absolutely. And that's why it worries me that we find that people aren't wanting to talk. I'm a great believer in the regulatory structures that we have in the housing sector, and I know that the Scottish Housing Regulator in particular is particularly going to start looking in terms of what housing associations north of the border are specifically doing about this. So my call would be, let's get a statutory regulatory function for social housing sector. Do what we can to backfill, because see if we don't, only more children are going to suffer, and more women are going to die needlessly. And run up to the general election, all the big charities that shelter and are getting their manifestos together. Our manifesto asks from the housing sector has to be, this has to be sorted. And I mean, I think of the good bits of legislation that we've got, and they are good, but they're only as good if they might be nicely typed on the vellum document and the King may have signed them or whatever. But until such times as local authorities and ourselves
have the wherewithal to enact them, and we've got to do that. So my plea to everybody who'll be listening to this, politician or no politician, campaigner or no campaigner, get your manifesto, ask in. The political parties have to address this. And really do it now.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. And CIH produced a if you like, our own version of a housing manifesto back in September, where we've got some specific asks in on domestic abuse, and also then that, you know, obviously you can't look at it in isolation. There's a huge issue, isn't there, around lack of housing supplies we touched on at the beginning, and making it so difficult for women or men to feel able to leave the home that they're in because it is so difficult to find an affordable home. Issues around women that don't have any recourse to public funds, and you know, there are so many issues that need to be looked at. But coming back to your the point around legislation, of course, there has been some positive developments in that sense, and certainly since the pledge was first introduced, we had the Domestic Abuse Act, didn't we, in 21 for England and Wales, and Callum's mentioned the Act in Scotland in 2018. So there's a framework around it, but of course there's more happening in a positive sense with the Social Housing Regulation Act. That means from April, all housing providers will be expected to have a policy in place, and that's something the regulator will be looking at. And I know the practical workings out of that are still to sort of flow through. But again, I guess back to an advert for DAHA, a reminder of just the support that's there and how important that accreditation process is. Because as you said, Judith, this isn't about everyone being expected to be an expert and solve all the problems. It's about understanding the extent of how far you can go, where you need to bring in other services, but being equipped to have a conversation in a way that you can deal with what might come out of it. But I wondered, and Judith, you might want to come in on this, there is also the Renters Reform Bill at the moment going through Parliament. I know that's something that DAHA and CIH working with you have raised some concerns on around potential unintended consequences for domestic abuse victims and survivors, with some of the changes being proposed on antisocial behaviour and rent arrears. Worth perhaps just highlighting that for those listening, because that is an area we can still look to influence while the bill's progressing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the reason it's so, I mean, obviously as a senior housing manager, we're also looking at private rented sector work within the whole housing programme as well. But the private rented sector is so important because, as you said, Rachel, there's just not enough social housing, and you know that's going to be the case for years. So women and children who are expected, and that's another thing, is, you know, we've got to let women stay safe in their own home and perhaps evict and move and house perpetrators of abuse. But whoever is the person to leave or the family to leave, they are relying on the private rented sector to live. And you know, currently in England we have nearly 5 million people living in the private rented sector, which is about a fifth of the households live in the private rented sector. So it's absolutely vital that it's I guess kind of regulated to the extent that we are holding landlords to account. And I think the Renters Reform Bill goes some way towards it's not equalising by any stretch, but moving the status of tenants within that sector up a little bit. But it still obviously has a lot of power for landlords. But we've submitted evidence. Obviously we're yet to see the amendments that have come out of the committee stage, but we highlighted the absolutely we need to get rid of section 21 no fault evictions, which adversely and you know, unequivocally impact on very vulnerable people, including families living with domestic abuse. So we've absolutely kind of pushed for that, and it's such a shame that I feel like, and I'll own this, but it feels like the government have found a way to create a delay for that to come in, particularly in this government. So it would be really good to see some changes there, and not wait for court reform before section 21 no fault evictions is removed. Actually, as part of our evidence that we submitted as from the policy and practice group, we looked at some of the evidence of what's happened in Scotland, where, as always, Scotland and Wales are always slightly ahead of England in terms of legislation and responses, because one of the concerns that across party has been that, because there's many landlords in government and other parties, as we know, real concerns that we're going to lose the private rented sector, we're going to lose landlords out of the private rented sector. All of the evidence tells us that that is just not the case. So, and there was some really good research done in Scotland, particularly on the impact of the legislation there that removed their no fault evictions. So that was really positive. But yeah, we've looked, we've kind of asked for, we've raised the concerns about the amendments of Ground 14, the antisocial behaviour. As I've just very briefly mentioned, many, there was some CIH in Wales research actually years ago that told us that a domestic abuse victim is 4 times more likely to have an antisocial behaviour complaint made against them. And it's really important that landlords are looking at that antisocial behaviour complaint with a domestic abuse lens. So the concerns for us were that the Renters Reform Bill changing the terminology from likely to cause distress, likely to cause a nuisance rather, to capable of causing a nuisance was really dangerous in terms of being able to evict somebody really quickly. So we've asked for that not to change, and we've given them case studies on that to kind of demonstrate why that's so important. And then looking at the introduction of Ground 8A, repeated rent arrears for possession. So we've asked for that not to happen at all, not to include, so the Renters Reform Act, when it comes in, not to have this additional ground for possession, because there are other ways, there are other grounds at Ground 10 and 11 that are already existing that enable landlords, if they have repeated and long-term rent arrears, that they can evict somebody for that reason. So don't introduce a new clause that allows landlords to evict based on rent arrears that, I mean, I haven't got the details right in front of me, but the very kind of short sort of period of rent arrears, which is highly likely to happen because, particularly post-separation or even within the relationship, economic abuse, as Nicola Sharp-Jess has thankfully kind of raised the status and understanding and got economic abuse into the Domestic Abuse Act definition of domestic abuse, which is amazing because it's just so prevalent. People are taking control of finances, and often this impacts women, as so often is the case, where the rent isn't being paid because of that economic abuse. So where it's rooted in economic abuse, and we want landlords to care enough to see that is happening, that they find a way to engage with that person and support them to engage in other organisations and not evict them because there's rent arrears have happened every other month in the last year. So there's so much that is good about the Renters Reform Bill, but there is so much that we need to see changed. The idea of having an ombudsman is really good. I was speaking on a programme called You and Yours at the beginning of the week on Radio 4 because there was a woman who was being was still having to pay her rent even though she'd separated because of the nature of the tenancy, and we were talking then about what the landlord's responsibility and the landlord being caring enough, I guess, to be able to support and help that woman get out of that tenancy because the perpetrator was still in that property and could pay the rent. So really there's so much more that we could be doing.
Yeah, thanks, Judith. Jim, I think you wanted to come in.
I've got major concerns about the passage of this bill through Parliament at the moment. I think it's been watered down so many times. Yeah. It's took long enough to get it into on the floor of the House and through the committee structures. I don't know if the government will last long enough to actually pass the legislation. It might be a good thing so we can bring it back and do it properly, in my opinion. But more power to your elbow. And earlier on, we spoke about the great work in legislation affecting England, Scotland, and Wales. But I remember a good few years ago, during my presidency, I asked one of the government ministers, and will the domestic violence this legislation apply to Northern Ireland? I was told yes, it would, and it doesn't.
No.
Right, and the political chaos in Northern Ireland means yet again in the social agenda, the people in Northern Ireland are suffering needlessly, in my opinion. But listen, everybody getting their threepence worth in about the renters reform bill, get it in there, campaign, argue. But whether or not this current government has got the appetite to do what it needs to do, I would say no. But you might want to edit that bit out.
Well, I think it's just completed its committee stage in the House of Commons, so our ability to influence now rests on the laws, where often you do get more detailed scrutiny. But it's certainly been encouraging to see the opposition using certainly a lot of the briefing that DAHA and the Policy and Practice Group shared, and as you stated, it's evidence based. There's lots of case studies to back it up. In terms of other areas that you can see going forward, I wonder whether you have any reflections as well. I'm conscious we briefly talked about COVID as a challenge and an opportunity, Judith. So you talked about the fact that it meant that more people were able to access things online, but equally it very much made people aware of just how acute the issue is, as home became for many people absolutely the opposite of a safe haven. I'm conscious we haven't talked specifically about cost of living, but of course that has really put and continues to put a lot of pressure on people. And we did a briefing paper and ran a webinar on that a little while back to look at the additional pressure that's placing. And I know that's not looking any better at the moment, is it? And it absolutely adds to the supply. Callum, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. So, just on that kind of cost of living, cost of leaving kind of conundrum, that, and I know Women's Aid England put a kind of really authoritative briefing over the summer, kind of looking at the impact on women. And I think we've all probably reflected and referenced that in the discussions. It's certainly been a kind of big policy ask for us in Scotland around that. The kind of the leaving funds. We know that individual landlords have leaving funds to support women who want to leave when you're leaving your clothes, your furniture, your life possessions behind because it's not safe for you to be there. Actually, the economic impact is so often overlooked. So welcomingly, and it's not sufficient, but the government in Scotland, there's just a pilot. There's 5 areas in Scotland where there's kind of money put aside, and those who are leaving their home, their social homes as a consequence of domestic abuse, can get up to £1,000. Now, it's a one-off. It doesn't deal with the kind of ongoing cost, but unfortunately,
but it's something.
It's a start. And actually, most policy, unfortunately, is never perfect in the first instance. It's built on the backs of the pilots. It's built on the backs of experiments. We recognise, we see the difference that makes someone's life, and we have it systemized. And I guess that's what I feel I keep coming back to, Rachel. There's a bit that we do as housing professionals, as membership bodies, and we work with best within the system we have. But that systemic change is only going to come from that political commitment. Housing is political. It always has been. It always will be. And we need to see that. We just need to be clear on what we want and make that persuasive collective case for it.
Yeah, Alison.
And I think in so many areas of policy, it's not limited to domestic abuse. The chronic undersupply of safe, affordable homes has so many effects. And one of the things I thought about quite a lot during the campaign was just I'd spent I was a magistrate for nearly 20 years, and I was on the family panel and chaired the ethics family panel. So a lot of where domestic abuse was suddenly social services had gone from completely ignoring domestic abuse to threatening to take away the children of women experiencing abuse, like 180-degree turn, without neither of which responses are necessarily particularly helpful with. But so I read a lot about the stories of people who were ending up within the care system. And housing was always there. It was never absent. And this will sound a bit daft, but the housing crisis has forced people into living together in a way, very, very early on within an organisation. I'm old enough to say I quite like to bring back the concept of courting, because sometimes if you take a bit of time, you realise you're not going to live together happily ever after. But people are cohabiting because they have nowhere else to live, and that is really, and nowhere to leave to. So we're putting people in, often in, two people living in a room who didn't know each other beforehand, who realise, this is a stressful situation. You may well then get a child introduced into that situation. No money, inadequate housing, no way to leave, and then we act surprised when there are other ramifications coming out of that. And it's hard to look at an area of public policy where, the supply of social housing would not have a positive impact. And I suppose my overwhelming frustration is that, housing always seems within government to be an afterthought, rather than something that we can't fix education, we can't fix health, we can't fix domestic abuse until we have a population that's adequately housed.
Absolutely. And I was in a meeting yesterday with a Conservative MP who talked about housing as an enabler for everything. Like you said, if you haven't got secure, safe, affordable housing, you can't build out your life in any sense: education, employment, family, connections, community. It's the solution, but it's the problem, depending on which way you look at it, isn't it? And you can't talk about domestic abuse without talking about housing and our provision in the UK. Jim?
There's been 2 acts of willful vandalism inflicted by our governments onto the people of this country. First was Right to Buy, the second was Brexit. And Right to Buy has been one of the biggest fiscal and socially immoral things to hit this country. And we're never, ever, ever going to get back to where we need to be unless there's a huge political will. I fondly look forward to the day when we get a new John Wheatley. This is 1924 is the 100th anniversary of the Wheatley Act, and by God in heaven, I yearn for a new Nye Bevan. The country may be on its hunkers. We may have been in a huge fiscal issue, but we were after the Second World War, and by God, we still managed to create National Health Service and build social houses. Until we build more social homes at affordable prices for people to rent, then we will not get out of this vicious cycle. So my plea again in manifestos, build social houses. And if I was sitting at home in my wee study, my election posters would be behind me. So you're probably quite glad we're not recording this, because my rosettes and all that will be up on the wall.
Yeah, well, you won't get any disagreement here, Jim. I mean, our CIH manifesto, our number 1 is, build more social homes. So no disagreement there. And look, we got an hour through before Brexit came up. I didn't see that one coming. I think we could go on all day with this, because I certainly could listen to you all for a lot longer. You've got so much amazing kind of professional and personal experience and insight to share on this. So thank you so much. But I'm conscious for those listening, they may not have that much time, and we don't want to lose people before the end. So I might look to wrap up now, but thank you so much. I hope everyone can hear, for those listening back, the absolute passion, commitment, and zeal to see more progress in this space, and things that kind of I think really came through around leadership at every level: personal leadership, organizational leadership, political commitment. If all of us sit back and think, well, it's not for me to fix or get involved with, then nothing changes, does it? And as you said, Alison, sometimes just getting a few people in a room they don't have to be senior, they just need to have a passion for change, positive change, and we can all make a difference. And Alison and Jim, your presidencies and those of your sort of predecessors and successors show what a difference that personal commitment can make in any given area. But a reminder for those listening that, you know, we've gone through that emotional roller coaster, I suppose, on this conversation of it's really difficult, but look, we can make a difference. The housing professional, you know, every housing professional can make a huge difference. And if you're a CIH member, and if you're listening and you're not, you should be, you know, the whole code of conduct, code of ethics, all around the values that we sign up to through the professionalism framework absolutely speak to what you talked about, Judith, through that DAHA accreditation. It's about being skilled, as you said, Alison. It's also about having the empathy, you know, the right mix of head knowledge and heart values, and together we can drive that systemic change that, as you said, Jim and Alison, we're not going to see it happen all in our lifetime. Domestic abuse, sadly, is always going to be there, but our sector response is something that can change, and over time we can challenge everybody in our own families and our personal connections in our workplaces to think about their attitude to it, and certainly to be calling out any sort of rhetoric or behaviour that we can see is not right, as we think about how we bring up our children as well as how we work with our colleagues and neighbours. Jim?
Can I just, before we wrap up, and I've thoroughly enjoyed the session, and sorry for my technical issues my end. I know I missed quite a wee bit, but I just like to pay a tribute and my personal thanks to Callum for the work that he's done in Scotland in this. And really, Callum, you should really take a huge bow, and my personal thanks to you and the rest of the team. My thanks to the leadership that my good friend Alison Inman inspired in me. And I thank you for that, Alison. I will always thank you for that. And Judith, and to everybody at DAHA, in the name of God, do not give up.
We won't. We won't
give up.
And
if we shout with one sector, one voice, we've shown in the past we can make a difference. Let's continue that. So my thanks to everybody, and thanks to you, Rachel, for pulling us together. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Judith,
just right back at you, Jim, though. Thank you again, and just, you know, for sharing your own personal story, and I know what an influence that's had and what a change that has made, so thank you for that. But also just again, thank you for, you've done your presidency, but you haven't given up. Same with Alison, and you know, both of you have absolutely inspired me, and I know Goody as well, and you know, absolutely inspired by the both of you. So it's just, we can't give up, and we won't give up, and DAHA is here to stay, and we just really want to make that difference, so that children, so that more gyms, there are not more gyms in the next kind of generation, because you should never have to experience this, and it is preventable. It is preventable. We can do something about it. And I think, again, Callum and Jim, thank you as men within this sector, within this world, speaking up for male violence against women. I, you know, thank you so much. Your voices are so important and so strong, and yeah, so from me, thank you.
Thank you everybody. And yeah, perhaps if I bring us back to the sort of text on the front page of the pledge, that in your words, Alison, our homes, our people, our problem. Let's all take that away, think about what that means for us. And if you're listening and you work in an organisation where you've signed up to the pledge but you can't really see what's happening as a result, then I hope this gives you the courage to go and ask about it and know that the support is there to move it forward. There's loads and loads of resources on the CIH site in the Knowledge Hub, lots of things you can access whether you're a member or not. We'll share some of the links when we send the recording out, and do have a look at the CIH housing strategy as well, which calls for, as Jim said, more homes, more social homes, but also some quite specific acts around domestic abuse as well. So thank you all so much. Keep doing what you're doing.
Thank you.
And perhaps we'll pick this up again in another year or two and see how we're getting on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
Take care, everyone.